I'd like to express my thanks to the organizers for asking me over and trying to address some of the issues that I will address some of the issues that the other two presenters have talked about, in particular Sigrid. What I would like to do is focus, however, on one, which is the issue of greenhouse gas and what I call cyclical growth, and how you could construct a growth model that could deal with these issues in the medium run, which would be demand-driven or Keynesian, and in the long run, which would be supply-constrained, or if you like, Ricardian. And let me sort of go through, this is going to be slightly more techy than the previous presentations, but not terribly techy. And what I'd like to do is run through a simple summary of what I want to say, and then put in a little bit more of the formal issues. That is capital accumulation, and I'll sort of duck all the Cambridge controversy issues about capital and just say it exists. Capital accumulation is demand-driven in the medium run, which is a Keynesian aspect of the model. Higher capital per capita increases output, which in turn increases CO2 emission. On the other hand, atmospheric CO2 emission cuts into output and growth of capital per capita. So you have sort of a fox and rabbit story, a very traditional fox and rabbit story, in the sense that CO2 is the fox, the predator, and capital per capita is the prey. And I'll go over some numerical simulations in a little while about how this works out. Now, the big difference between the fox and rabbit model that we all know and love is that the traditional story is that the rabbit population starts to increase for whatever reason. The foxes grow, their numbers increase and begin to prey on the rabbits. After a while, the rabbits crash, and after a little while more, the foxes crash, and then you rerun the cycle. I mean, that's a very familiar story in sort of traditional ecology. Now, the thing is, when you talk about climate change, the fox is immortal for all practical purposes. When you build up atmospheric CO2, it's not going to go away. It's not going to crash. And so we have to modify the traditional story a little bit. And the modification essentially says that after output crashes, it's not going to go back up because the atmospheric CO2 is already up there. Now, there are a bunch of conventions that people adopt in growth theory, for better or for worse. I think for worse. But in any case, I'm going to assume that the growth model that I'll sketch out will converge to a so-called steady state, where everything is increasing at the same rate. But the thing is that if you're talking about CO2 accumulation, the system has to converge to a stationary state, not a steady state, with everybody growing at the same rate, because if CO2 concentration and output were to grow in a steady state at a constant rate, then that would be impossible. So you have to go to a stationary state where everything is stable, and that is the Ricardian aspect of the model. Now, there's one modification that one can make. You can talk about investment in mitigation of greenhouse gas emission. And that can, in fact, lead to a non-dismal stationary state, but you have to spend a fair bit on the mitigation. That is something on the order of magnitude of current expenditures worldwide on defense. Current world GDP is about $60 trillion. And Andy Haldane's estimates are crazy that you mentioned. I mean, if he's got a $200 trillion loss against $60 trillion GDP.
Over the long run.
Yeah, that's many years.
Yeah.
In any case, if GDP is 60 trillion and defense spending is on the order of 1.5% of that, if you spend that much on mitigation, you can offset the crisis. But that's a lot of money. It takes a lot of organization. And it's not clear to me how it would happen. In any case, and here we get into the slightly more techie story. There are essentially three dynamic variables: CO2 concentration, capital stock per capita, and labor productivity. The increase in G is proportional to output. Increase in capital is essentially driven by investment minus depreciation and population growth. And productivity growth is driven by the growth rate of energy intensity. That is a strong theme in ecological economics. is that labor productivity is largely driven by more use of energy per worker. And we built that into the model. There's some modifications we want to make, but I'll get to that in a couple of minutes. There's the Ricardian long run. Everything grows at a zero rate. There's a Keynesian medium run, where output and employment are determined by effective demand. That is, by investment, the investment capital ratio, G, and the ratio of mitigation expenditure to output, M. Capital utilization, which is the output capital ratio, I'm going to assume is going to be driven by the profit share through investment demand. So in the jargon that is we all know and love, output is I'm going to assume that output is so-called profit-led. But I'm going to assume also that the profit share decreases with the ratio of employment to population, so that there's a profit squeeze. So we have a profit-led, profit squeeze, medium run, and that's the macro dynamics, the Keynesian side of the story that I'm building in. I'm also going to assume that CO2 concentration, rising CO2 concentration in the atmosphere is going to squeeze profits through the storms and the sort of upsets of the production system that would occur as a consequence of global warming. An alternative would be to assume that increasing CO2 concentration is going to reduce the capital stock by increasing the rate of depreciation. And so I'll talk briefly about both those variants, but those are the two things I have in mind. There's a key identity which says that the labor population ratio is equal to the capital population ratio, kappa, times capital utilization divided by productivity. And if through that identity, you'll get stable adjustment of capital stock growth. An alternative closure, that is, as Peter Flaschel has pointed out, you could either have emphasized rather, you could either have a profit-led profit squeeze economy or a wage-led wage squeeze economy. I chose to use the one modeling approach because at least at business cycle frequencies, a wage squeeze is not observed, and also growth would be unstable if you had the wage squeeze situation. So that's the way the model is set up. Now, even slightly more techie, there's something in the climate science literature which is called the Kaya identity. And what that basically says is that the emission of greenhouse gas, G dot, is proportional to energy in use minus the amount of mitigation that's being undertaken. And then there's some natural rate of dissipation, omega, which is very small. So the notion that the fox is immortal, almost immortal, essentially comes from the notion that this omega is very small. The mitigation expenditure can reduce the growth rate of emissions. Capital stock basically scales the system. There's no aggregate production function since this is a demand-driven model, and capital per capita grows with real investment G, gross investment G, minus delta, the depreciation rate, minus the rate of population growth. In the stationary state, population growth will have to be zero. So there will be a steady state at investment equals depreciation. And that's one characterization of the steady state that the model will have to go to. Now, I think I will sort of skip the details here about how the model is actually working. But what we have is essentially a medium-term story where the profit share depends on employment and greenhouse gas emissions. You could do the same thing, or greenhouse gas level. You could do the same thing in a solo model, a full employment solo model, and you'll get rather similar results. And the reason why you get similar results in both the solo model and the demand-driven model is that the accumulation equations are the ones that really matter. That is the accumulation of greenhouse gas and the accumulation of capital. And those are the ones that determine the dynamics of the system, the details of the medium-term adjustment in some sense, although not in all senses, are secondary. Now, suppose we have a steady state in the model, and we begin to look at the null-clients for that steady state. I'll come back and discuss in a minute what these are trying to show. That is, you start out in a situation where capital per capita is about 29. That is, there's $200 billion worth of capital and a world population of 7 billion. So that gives you capital per capita roughly of 29. Current greenhouse gas concentration is like 400 parts per million by volume. Now, what you'll then have a situation, what you then have are null-clients, are each of these lines corresponds, these lines correspond, the red line and the red line and the blue dashed line correspond to zero growth of greenhouse gas. And the difference between the two lines is that on the horizontal axis, here we have greenhouse gas concentration on the vertical axis, capital per capita on the horizontal axis. And the difference between the two lines for greenhouse gas, the two null-clients for greenhouse gas, is mitigation. That is, you could have zero mitigation, where you get a very steep line, and you could have mitigation of 1.25% of GDP, which gives you the line with the lower slope. The other two lines are essentially null-clients for capital stock growth. So you have two possible equilibria in this two steady-state equilibria that are illustrated in this model. One, no mitigation leads in a steady state with the numbers that we chose to work with. It leads in a steady state to something like greenhouse gas concentration of something like 750, and output capital stock per capita of something like 28, which is way below the initial level. On the other hand, if you have mitigation, you can go to a point with greenhouse gas concentration of somewhere in the 480 range, and capital per capita somewhere in the 45 range. Greenhouse gas concentration of a bit less than 500 would correspond to 1 degree of warming above the current situation, or 2 degrees of warming above the baseline, above the pre-industrial baseline. So that this is where, or the upper equilibrium here is where the economy might conceivably end up, but again at the cost of a lot of resources devoted to mitigation. You get a similar story, which I won't go into, if greenhouse gas destroys capital stock by higher depreciation, as opposed to reducing the profit share. Here are some key values in the two steady states. If you just look at the upper panel, greenhouse gas concentration goes from 400 to 760 under business as usual, goes to 486 under the mitigated, and similar results for capital output per capita and employment, the employment ratio, the ratio of employed people to the total population. And in fact, with mitigation, employment in fact improves somewhat. Similar story under the other scenario. Now, here we have an illegible diagram, which I won't even talk about, and here we have another one. But what I do want to do is talk a little bit more about productivity growth and employment. That is, it's important to recognize that growth is endogenous. You can't talk about degrowth or reduced growth or something like that in the macroeconomy because you don't control growth directly. Growth comes out of what's going on across the system. And you'd have to worry about what you wanted to change in the system to affect the rate of growth, and the same is true of employment. Now, we assumed various things to get the steady state results. That is, population we assumed would grow from 7 to 10 billion over a period of 50 or 60 years. That's more or less the central tendency in the projections. Energy intensity, that is, right now, is about 4 kilowatts per employed worker. It takes about 100 watts, 100, 200 watts to maintain subsistence population. That's the amount of energy that they're using. At the worldwide level, there are about 4 kilowatts used now per employed worker. This is fossil fuel energy converted to power. So that employed workers are now using about 4 kilowatts. In Saudi Arabia, it's like 19. The numbers vary. And so what we did was assume that the energy use would go from 4 kilowatts to 6, and labor productivity, which is now about 20,000 per worker, would go to 35,000. Now, here are some slides, which are somewhat out of date, about empirical relationships between labor productivity growth on the horizontal axis and the energy-labor ratio, growth in energy-labor ratio on the vertical axis. And what you get are rather strong positive relationships. So, if you like an ostinato theme, just like Ravel's Bolero, is that labor productivity is closely tied to energy intensity. That's sort of a dogma in ecological economics, and it's something we built into the model. So then, given that we characterize the steady states in this way, we then have to worry about transient paths to track dynamics toward the steady state. And we want, now remember that these transient growth trajectories are going to be affected by our assumptions about growth of population, growth of labor productivity, and growth of energy intensity over the next century or so. And what I want to do is first look at business as usual growth, where there's an adverse effect of CO2 concentration on profitability. And what you get is the following, that this is business as usual. Capital stock per capita grows for about 8 decades, then it crashes and settles down to a very low level, whereas greenhouse gas concentration grows and just stays up there. That's the difference between that's the fox story in this fox and rabbit simulation. Employment gets clobbered, as you see in the middle there. Output gets clobbered, so that CO2 concentration, as I say, stabilizes, and output stabilizes. Output stabilizes about 60 trillion, which is its initial level. But output, because there's population growth and output per capita, and there's population growth, so output per capita falls by about 35%. Now we can look at mitigation, and you have to worry about the cost of mitigation. A central sort of upper middle estimate of the cost of mitigation would be something like $160 per metric ton of carbon. There are lots of numbers being thrown around about the cost of mitigation, but say it's 160 per metric ton of carbon, or $44 per ton of CO2. And as I say, with the mitigation outlay of about 1.25% of world output, you get a much different story. That is, capital stock per capita stabilizes, greenhouse gas concentration stabilizes at a level which would correspond to about a 2-degree increase over pre-industrial level, and you get sort of relatively stable dynamics in those situations. Now, also, if mitigation is front-loaded, that is, we really ramp up mitigation expenditure now, then that's going to give you a leg up on reducing carbon dioxide accumulation in the future. So front-loading mitigation can lead to much more favorable results. But that means starting to do it now. Some people talk about a climate policy ramp, whereas mitigation expenditure would rise up slowly over time, and that's probably not such a great idea. Or at least that's in the context of this kind of model. Now, and again, these results are largely driven by the convergence patterns of capital per capita and greenhouse gas concentration to steady state. And the same basic pattern appears under variant adjustments. That is, higher CO2 concentration reduces profitability. Or, thank you, or it shifts down or leads to capital destruction, or it shifts down a neoclassical aggregate production function in a solar model. In all those variants, you get essentially similar results. Now, let me just in closing talk a little bit about transient paths to steady state and impacts on labor, since that's one of the themes, the major theme of this conference. And again, just to emphasize, growth, employment, productivity all emerge from an overall macro system. You cannot sensibly talk about affecting one of those outcome variables without saying something about what you're doing to the system to try to influence the outcome. Now, this is a demand-driven model, which means that employment is determined as a so-called lump of labor by the level of output and the level of productivity. And I mean, that's how the model is set up. You can set up different models and you can come up with different stories, but in a simple demand-driven model is a lump of labor model. Or as neoclassical economists say, it's subject to a lump of labor fallacy. And, but that's just how this particular world works. Now, the elasticity of employment with respect to population, the elasticity of employment with respect to population at a steady state, the elasticity with respect to output is going to be equal to -1. That is, output is fixed in a steady state. So if productivity goes up by 1%, employment's got to go down by 1%. And that's just how it goes in steady state economics. If you're along a transient path, the elasticity of the employment ratio to productivity is about -0.8, because productivity stimulates investment demand and stimulates output. So you get an offsetting factor, which is significant. Now, in the business as usual steady state, this employment population ratio is 65% below its initial level. That's because output stagnates and productivity and population increase over time. In a mitigation solution, the employment population ratio rises by a little bit. And at a steady state with zero population growth, gross investment equals depreciation, so you don't have to be investing to create employment. Now, second observation is that the real wage is just equal to 1 minus pi, which is the labor share, times productivity. The profit share stabilizes in the steady state, goes down by a few points. So that basically means that the real wage has to rise over time, roughly in line with labor productivity. I mean, that's just built into the accounting, and it hasn't been true for the last 3 decades in the advanced countries, but that's because profit shares have been rising. Profit shares will not go up forever. Will they, Jerry? So if in the long run the labor share, profit share stabilizes, then the real wage has to grow roughly in line with labor productivity. There are also several feedback effects which we have not really modeled fully, which are likely to be important in sort of a three-dimensional system of capital, greenhouse gas, and productivity. And let me just mention them briefly in passing. There's sort of a Caldor effect, which says that productivity is going to increase with capital formation. There's an induced innovation effect, which says that productivity is going to rise with a higher real wage. And then there's something you could call a Kellogg-Sen effect. W.K. Kellogg was the cornflakes magnate in the 1930s, who laid off, who sort of reduced the working week for his employers and Battle Creek employees in Battle Creek, Michigan, and found out he could produce as many cornflakes. So basically, productivity went up in response to lower employment. And Sen said more or less the same thing about subsistence agriculture. So there are these feedbacks that are also likely to be important. We haven't looked at it in the context of the model, but they may well be important in practice. So there are a lot of complicated things going on in terms of the labor market. And that's something that we want to look at a bit more in the future. Finally, this work was supported by the Institute for New Economic Thinking, and the paper is co-authored by Duncan, Foley, and me, but in fact, all these other people did the work, and so they should be honored as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you.